Hi, and welcome to The Capsule Life, a show for the most casual and dedicated fans of comics and a member of the Comic Watch family. I'm your host, Sean. Join me and discover what the world of comics and graphic novels have to offer. From one-on-one interviews with industry professionals, roundtable discussions with passionate fans, and reviews on the latest comics, TV shows, and movies. Now let's dive right on in. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the show. I am excited to share with you that we are starting a new sub-series of episodes called Inside the Panels, where we have comic creators join us to talk about their journey and experience as a whole. So instead of talking about a particular book or series, we'll talk about their entire career so far. And to start off this series, we have a returning guest of the show, David Pepose. A former crime reporter turned storytelling professional, David has tackled comic strip homicide, wedding-crashing bank robbers, and post-apocalyptic fairy tales as the Ringo Award-winning writer of Savage Avengers, Avengers Unlimited, Spencer and Locke, Going to the Chapel, Grand Theft Astro, The OZ, Scouts Honor, and more. David's books have been featured in The Hollywood Reporter, comicbook.com, and IO9, and have ranked on Barnes & Noble's Best Comics and Graphic Novels list. His writing has been called stunningly subversive by IGN and absurdly good time by Nerdist, while Syfy has described his work as utterly insane or pure genius, or admittedly, maybe both. In addition to developing properties for comics, TV, and film, he has also worked for CBS, Netflix, and Universal Studios. Raised in St. Louis, David currently resides in sunny Los Angeles, where he lives with his understanding partner, their rambunctious terrier, and at least 6 deadlines. David, welcome back to the show.
Hi, thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, thank you for coming on. And I wanted to say that I don't think I realized that you were a former crime reporter before you got into comics writing. And maybe you mentioned that in the first episode that you were on the show, but I completely forgot about that. Tell us what that was like, just, as a profession. And was there something about that that made you decide that you want to go into being a comics writer, or was it just something you've always wanted to do?
Yeah, I mean, it was my first job out of college. I wrote for a newspaper in rural Massachusetts called the Berkshire Eagle, and so I covered things. I was often on the night shift, so I would be calling all the police departments every night, just trying to be like, what's going on today? Has there been any assaults, any car accidents, anything in that vein? And it was a fun job. It certainly made me less afraid of a deadline or a word count. But I've been a comics fan my whole life. I'm a third generation comics fan. My mother was a comics reader. My grandfather was a comics reader, and so I'm kind of living the dream now, getting to be a professional comics writer. But yeah, there's always a nice camaraderie in the newsroom that I do miss. And I think it just kind of taught me how to write tight and to write fast. And just kind of, you got to get something out. So get something out.
Right. And I imagine that the style of writing in that process is probably different from crime reporting to writing comics. Is that right?
Yes and no. Structurally is kind of actually the thing that they really do have a lot of overlap. Because you write a news article and you find out that you have either a certain word count or a certain inch count, and so you kind of write what you have to write, but then you think like, okay, like how do I structure that? How do I introduce the flow of information? Is there anything that, like, if we had more room online that you would add in that you might not be like you have to have it in print?
Right.
And I do that modular style of writing. I do that with my comics writing quite a bit. Where I think, okay, this scene is good, but it's not really working where it is here. So I kind of lop off the beginning and I lop off the end, and I kind of shift it somewhere else. And so kind of learning how to visualize the structure of a story, that is something I really picked up as a reporter. And so that I do take with me everywhere. But yes, beyond that, it is a little bit of a different animal. But the soft skills of just kind of knowing how to write fast, write on a deadline, and being able to structure it, that's something that I really did learn as a reporter, and I do take with me as a comics writer.
Nice. And I imagine that some of the stories that you came across during that profession, you probably kind of put in the back burner of like, this might be a good story for a comic later, right?
I mean, it's weird because it's, Berkshire County, Massachusetts, it was a very interesting socioeconomic environment where you kind of had, rich Northeasterners, summer homes next to like really abject poverty. And so, and all you had to do was kind of take a turn down a certain street for a couple of blocks and you'd cross that threshold pretty fast. So, I mean, some of those stories, maybe not the stories themselves, but occasionally some of the mood, that might have picked up in things like Spencer and Locke, for sure. And I will say, like, I did a bunch of stories on returning veterans, particularly like how they dealt with mental health on their way back, and that's something that certainly has kind of resonated in my work, both with Spencer and Locke and the OZ. And even I think even if I don't make it explicit, I think that's something that does kind of echo through most of my projects, in terms of sort of mental health and how do people cope, and perhaps not the healthiest of ways. But beyond that, I don't think there were any specific stories that I brought from my newspaper days, because there was a lot of gang crime, coming in from Albany. And also just like a lot of rural crime, which like it was weird, and, there were definitely some weird crime stories over there, but none that I think I've been able to turn into a comic yet, but never say never.
Right. Yeah. Gotcha. Well, and one other thing about your bio, because we haven't even dove into the interview yet, but one other thing about your bio is, I guess I didn't realize that you had also wrote for like CBS and Netflix and Universal Studios.
Yeah, I've worked for them. I worked in corporate at CBS for a long time. That was actually my day job when I sold my first book. I worked with their publicity and PR teams on all the shows. So, and that was really useful in terms of kind of learning like the lay of the land and learning kind of how do you make shows accessible. That was really CBS's big strength, compared to a place like, say, NBC, where they'd have a show like Revolution, for example, which you probably don't remember that show right now.
Oh,
but,
I do.
the first season,
Yeah.
kind of blew everybody away. And that was something I kind of learned at CBS was, a first season, getting a hit with a first season, that is tough. That's challenging. But how do you kind of build a series for the long haul? How do you build a CSI? How do you build an NCIS? How do you build a Big Bang Theory? Shows that weren't necessarily, blockbusters in their first couple of seasons, but the longevity of it all.
Right.
And they would build on each other. Sometimes you'd have a lead in of a very popular show, and then you bring in another show to come in right after it to sort of kind of help, build its audience. But also it was a question of accessibility. I mean, you watch any episode of The Big Bang Theory, and I'm not going to say it's the most sophisticated show on television, but you can pretty much turn on any episode of that and get a good story with that cast, with that premise. You don't have to have a lot of continuity to understand it. Same thing with like NCIS or CSI. You can really just kind of plug in at any time. And so that was a real eye opener for me. And then I did some work for Netflix when I came out here. They were doing a new digital initiative, and so I helped out a little bit with that. It was sort of one of those. They were big eye opening experiences for me. And really kind of helped me focus a little bit on the comic storytelling of it all. I in certain ways, comics it's a much smaller pond than all of these sort of multimedia conglomerate giants. But I do think there's like a degree of discipline and a degree of cross-pollination that you can kind of take from one industry to the other. And so it's been really useful to kind of have those experiences at these big places and being able to say, okay, like you have, the streaming model, the bingeable model. So how do you write in a way that like it works in like in a sustainable chunk month to month. But also, if somebody picks up the trade, you know, how's that experience going to work out for them?
Mhm.
And so it's been a really nice way to kind of calibrate my writing style while I've sort of been in the trenches, kind of plugging away at my own comics work.
Nice. Well, I did not realize that your writing career just, is very expansive. So that's very impressive. I'm very happy to hear that. So congratulations to you.
Thank you.
That's really awesome. And just like you said, I think those kinds of mediums, there's a lot of overlap, just as you said, but there's also those kind of unique challenges, and that the medium definitely informs the writing, just as you mentioned before, is the way that you might write a television show for Netflix wouldn't be the same way for another show like CBS if they're doing, releasing week by week, or even as you mentioned before with the comics as well too. So
Yeah.
that was really insightful. So thank you
Thank
for
you.
that. So let's dive into the interview. And for every guest that we have on the show, I always like to ask them the same question. And that is, what is your comic book origin story? What was it that got you into comics? Was it a particular person or a particular issue? And what's kind of led you to become a fan of comics since then?
Yeah, I mean, let's see. Let's see what the issue was. It was Amazing Spider-Man 346. I got that as a kid.
That is very specific. That's awesome.
Yeah, it was Spider-Man versus Venom. It was right before they went to the island. So yeah, and a few others. I got an issue of Captain America where he's fighting the Ice Worm with Jack Frost. An issue of Silver Surfer where it's Drax the Destroyer versus Adam Warlock. I didn't really understand any of the context for that. Infinity War #2. That was kind of a big game changer for me, where I realized like all these characters kind of knew each other, which was very exciting, especially my man Spider-Man. So yeah, I think I've always had comics like as part of my upbringing, and I think I really just I love the art. I think the art was really kind of the thing that sealed the deal for me as a kid. And I grew up in Missouri. I didn't really have a lot of artistic role models. I think if I had been told what like reference art was as a child, I might have a very different career right now. I didn't know what reference was until I was in my mid-20s. So I had already kind of well missed the boat to pursue an art career. But yeah, and I think the characters, I think there's a lot of characters that always really resonated with me. There's Spider-Man, Batman, Wolverine. Those were really kind of the big ones. And then, as I've sort of gotten older and I've sort of appreciated more and more comics, like for example, the Avengers. I love writing the Avengers. And I think something that's been really fun for me, especially as I've been doing more and more licensed work, is, you find something to love about these characters. And that's part of the job, is you say, all right, like everybody kind of has their own angle on a particular character. What's yours? What's the thing that really resonates? What stands out to you? What, if somebody was telling you this story, would excite you? So yeah, I've been a big comics fan, really as long as I can remember, whether it's, the old school Marvel and DC of the 90s, things like Crimson, things like Spawn, 52 and Civil War. There's so many, Fraction and Brubaker on Iron Fist, Fraction on Iron Man, Dan Slott on Spider-Man, Jeff Johns on Green Lantern and Justice Society, Remender on Uncanny Avengers and Punisher. There's so many creators up there. I Devin Grayson, her work on Batman, Gotham Knights is kind of like a Rosetta Stone for a lot of my work. So there's really, it's there's a lot. Yeah, I feel like I live and breathe this stuff. And I've been really fortunate that I've sort of had my foot in the industry in some capacity. I think next year, 2023 will mark 15 years for me. Yeah, I'm really grateful. It's the best job in the world.
And earlier when you were talking about growing up, you had referred to yourself as a third generation comics reader, which I have to say, I don't think I've heard anyone described themselves that way before. So I love that, how you grew up with your, I think you said your mother and your grandfather were also comics readers. So it sounds like you always had comics around the house because of that. Did your mom and grandfather had specific comics that they enjoyed reading that kind of, ciphered down to you?
My grandfather passed when I was pretty young, and so we never really had a lot of overlap. And it's something my mother always regrets, is that when my grandfather passed, I was probably 3 or 4, and my grandmother, not knowing what they were worth, threw out all of his comics. And looking back, those, they could have sent me to college on those comics. My mother, let's see, she read Fantastic Four, Archie, a lot of the old school Marvel books. Those were kind of coming out in her childhood. I don't know if she was a huge DC fan. No, that's not true. Actually, she was a DC fan, because I do remember as a kid, we got into a big debate about how Lex Luthor lost his hair. And, I grew up post-Crisis. I was born as Crisis on Infinite Earths was coming out. And so I was just like, Lex shaves his head. Grant Morrison said so. And my mother was like, no, Lex, was doing an experiment, and, Superboy used his super breath thinking there was a fire going on, and the chemicals, took all his hair. Mm-hmm. I remember waking up the next day, and my mom had found this scan online and printed it out and put it on my door. So, I guess she read some DC too. But yeah, I think it was, I think it was one of those things that I don't think they knew what they were going to unleash when they gave me my first comics, and I was just obsessed. Those handful of comics, and every so often they'd give me another set of comics that would just reignite the whole thing. I remember Target had a collection of Daredevil, The Man Without Fear. That was a really influential one on me.
Yeah,
I was way too young to have read it, but I did read it. The Clone Saga. I remember having those flip issues when that started.
Mm-hmm.
Love that. Death and Return of Superman.
Yes.
Those were my first trades. Nightfall. I think about Nightfall all the time. That's probably the single comic series that really resonates the most with me, and I'd love to do a riff on something like that someday.
Oh, yeah.
And then as I got older, I would find new things, like Spawn or Crimson. I was really into those in my early teens. Mm-hmm. And I just every time that I thought I was done, I'd find a new book that would kind of pull me back in.
Right.
Why the Last Man, anything that Grant Morrison's done, mm-hmm. From JLA to New X-Men, to All-Star Superman, mm-hmm. Transmet, Preacher. There's so many that I'm sure I'm missing, but yeah, I don't think, my every so often my parents will say oh, the comics weren't like this when I was a kid. But I like that, it's kind of, there's a little bit more of a garage band mentality now. Mm-hmm. And that's cool that, it's a nice way to make your voice heard without necessarily the rigmarole of having to get, a bunch of filmmaking equipment and getting a whole bunch of actors on set and trying to find locations. This is very much an industry where, you can, using the internet, as a writer, you can find an artist and a colorist and a letterer, and that's your band. Mm-hmm. And you can just start playing. And that's I think a really cool DIY ethos that is really it's really fun to get to explore.
That's awesome. Oh, thank you for sharing your story. That's really cool.
Sure.
Well, let's talk about, some of your first comics as a professional writer, which includes stories like Going to the Chapel, Spencer and Locke, The OZ, Scout's Honor. And looking back at the process of writing these stories, what were some of the lessons that you've learned as a writer, whether it was the process itself or what it meant to work in the industry?
Boy, well, I think that, having my first book, a couple books out, that was sort of this idea of, oh, okay, like maybe I can do this. I think I always had this fear that, I was going to get like rejected like a bad organ, like I get a book out, and it's a one off. And thankfully I'm sort of getting to the point now where I don't necessarily feel like that anymore. But I think every book's its own animal. Every book has kind of come together a little bit differently. Um, and so my process kind of shifts a little bit. There are certain concepts that kind of come together in different ways, and doing things in the license sandbox is even more different, because you've already sort of got like a very firm, okay, you have this character and this is what this character does. Now, how do you kind of warp a story around them? But yeah, I think for me, it's just a matter of finding the angle. It's always about what is the most interesting way to tell the story to me. What's like, I mean, these things are hard. It's really challenging. And so the idea of trying to like kind of hack through a story that you don't love, that sounds miserable, whereas that's why it's like you have to find like something that interests you. So, for example, Spencer and Locke, which was sort of my breakout book. That was What If Calvin and Hobbes Grew Up in Sin City? And like I said, big Frank Miller fan. Daredevil the Man Without Fear was kind of a very seminal book for me as a kid. And so I was like, I'd love to do a book in that vein, really channel Frank's voice. And so for me, it was like, okay, like I'd love to do something with like a psychological twist. Memento is like one of my favorite movies. And so that became kind of the thing that was very interesting to me, approaching that book, where it's like, it's about a hard-boiled detective whose partner's his childhood imaginary friend. And kind of what does that mean about him as a character? And so you got to kind of vacillate between a character study of sort of what was this guy's home life like, his childhood, that it sort of forced him to invent his own best friend, while also kind of just being like, well, what kind of cool action stuff can we throw in there? Whereas going to the chapel, which was sort of a crime rom-com, it was a hostage situation at a wedding. For me, there it's kind of like, okay, well, that's a comedy. So like, where can I find bits of humor to kind of inject in what's otherwise a very tense hostage situation? And that's kind of, I don't know. I'm a big believer in like dessert first, because otherwise, like, how the hell are you going to do this? I don't know. I mean, maybe there are writers out there who are more disciplined than I am, but for me, I don't like the idea of taking on work that like doesn't interest me, that doesn't excite me. Life's too short, and I only have a finite amount of stories and books in me. So I might as well like do something that like excites me, and something that kind of satisfies my ambitions. So if I wanted to do something that was like a little bit more trippy and psychedelic, like, okay, that's something, if that's on my checklist of a book that I want to do, chances are I will be approaching my next projects with that in mind. And sometimes it kind of comes out of order. For example, my book, The OZ, that was one of my early pitches, of sort of the idea of trying to do like a fantasy war mashup story. But meanwhile, like my series Grand Theft Astro, which has sort of been long in development, we're just sort of, the art has been kind of coming in fits and starts. That was just as early. And that was like, me, that started as I wanted to do a sports comic. And it quickly turned into sort of a Fast and the Furious in space with like a time travel element. So I think the exploration is really kind of the key. You if you find something that's interesting to you, you got to follow it as best you can. And usually, like, if there's not enough meat there, you'll kind of lose steam pretty fast. But if there's something to it, that enthusiasm, that's what will really kind of keep you going in what will be a marathon. I mean, maybe there are people out there who write books like effortlessly and really quick, but I'm not one of those people. It's a marathon. And so you better damn well find something you like about it, because otherwise you will not make it to the finish line.
Right. Is there a comic where you've had to put away or stop because that happened for you, or have you just been blessed enough that you haven't gotten to that point
Well,
yet?
there's a few. I mean, mercifully, you find out pretty quick.
Right.
Where you're just like, oh, okay, I have one set piece here. Great.
Mhm.
All right, well, I'll save that for something else. And there have been a few other projects that like I've written outlines, and then I'm kind of like, well, it didn't really get any traction anywhere, and it, usually rejection is like the final catalyst for me, where something like the OZ, for example, where we pitched that to a few places, who said, we really love this concept, but it's not the right fit for us at this time. That like I was kind of like, all right, I'm going to make this out of spite, and that's sort of like the key ingredient for me on a lot of my creator-owned work. Whereas there are other projects that I've pitched where somebody said, it's not really the right fit for us right now, and I've kind of been like, yeah, after writing that outline, like I wasn't really vibing with it either, and so that kind of goes away. And every project you learn something, even if it doesn't see the light of day. I think you learn something from it, and it's never to say like it won't ever see the light of day. It just might not be the time right now. Sometimes other projects come out, that are similar. I had a project that I was really excited about, that I was working on last year, that I'd written like a first issue and I had written an outline, and then something came out this year that was close enough to it that I was like, all right, we're gonna have to kind of wait and see. At minimum, it's going to be a little while before we like can tackle this again.
Right.
So it happens. But I think it just kind of goes to show that like you really only want to the projects that you kind of go past the outline stage. You really got to love them, because otherwise it's just not worth the time and the hassle.
Right. Well, and it seems to be working well for you this year because you have been able to write 4 stories for Marvel. I think it's, Fantastic Four, Elektra, Moon Knight, and the current run of Savage Avengers.
Yeah.
So I wanted to ask you, what's that been like working for Marvel and working on multiple stories at the same time? I know you mentioned earlier that because these are characters that already been established and everything, that's a whole new world for you and working with that. But just kind of curious, like from going from all these indie books that you've been creating on your own to stepping into an established world, what's that been like for you?
Yeah, it was a big learning curve, and it's one that I think I'm still learning. I've been writing for Marvel now a little over a year. I started working with them last summer, and it's really exciting. I mean, this is a universe that I've grown up reading, grown up loving, and I get to interact with it in a more granular way. And I think some of that is based on like the books that I've been lucky enough to get, the projects I've been lucky enough to get, and sort of my take on like Marvel as a bigger tapestry. And also that I'm lucky enough that I've been working with like Tom Brevoort as my editor, who he's probably the longest serving comics editor in the business, and he knows kind of the Marvel continuity inside and out. Just today, for example, I was emailing him about a list of villains for something, and just being like, hey, like, who am I allowed to use here? Like, is somebody booked? Is somebody, do you think any of this is a no-go? And he very quickly was like, yeah, these, this person works. Don't do this. But yeah, it's one of those things that it's an interesting skill set. On the one hand, the world is kind of built out for you. I don't have to create the whole Marvel universe from whole cloth, which is great. However, you first off, you're playing sort of in the grand scheme of things. You kind of have to figure out like, oh, okay, like, for example, when I was putting together the cast on Savage Avengers, I had a very long list of potential characters that I was like, I think any of these characters could work for a team. I'm going to need like a certain combination of them to make this work. And, there were a few. Carnage is a good example. Carnage is one of the people I put on the list, because I was like, that'd be kind of cool to have like a Hannibal Lecter on the team where you don't know what side he's going to come down on in any particular conflict. And at the time, I did not know that like Rom V was working on a Carnage series of his own. So that's the sort of stuff that you work with your editors around, and you have to kind of pivot if something you can't get your heart too set on something, but at the same time, you need to be ready that if they tell you yes, you're going to sort of love it with all your heart. And conversely, you can't say like, oh, I got to pin all my hopes on this thing, because sometimes you might have to get your second choice or your third choice, and you kind of have to pivot around that, and not just pivot around it, but kind of figure out how to make it work. I think a lot about Weapon H, who's in my Savage Avengers roster, and that was one of those things that my editors, I said, I need somebody with Wolverine claws in this book. Like I don't think this book works without somebody with Wolverine claws. And a lot of my choices were booked elsewhere. Dakin was over in Marauders. He was kind of my first choice. Logan himself was doing another time travel story in Lives and Deaths of Wolverine. So that wasn't really like a good fit. And my editor said, well, what about this guy Weapon H? And at first I was kind of like, oh, I don't know about that. But then as I thought about it, I was like, oh, you know what? I have an angle for this guy. Like, and let's build onto his power set a little bit. So we'll sort of turn him into Dial H for Hulk, where he can turn into any Hulk. And so that's kind of like a cool, like that's I think the name of the game as far as I'm concerned, is you kind of have to do these kind of roles. I think it's unlike a creator-owned thing where you can come up with a concept, say Inception. Let's throw that out there. I just watched that recently. Where Christopher Nolan probably was like, hey, what if we did a heist movie, but it was a telepathic heist movie, and it was somebody stealing somebody's thoughts, or in this case, like having to plant a thought in somebody's mind. You can kind of build a character around that. You can have the concept, and you can say, okay, well, we're gonna have Leo as like the Danny Ocean, and we're gonna have JGL as sort of his Brad Pitt. We'll have a couple other colorful characters who fill the roles, the archetypes of the heist team. Well, you can't necessarily do that if you can't do it that way. If your editors are like, okay, well, you're going to do a story about the Hulk. Okay, well, like that already kind of self-selects certain tones, certain worlds that you can do. I mean, maybe somebody else who's not me could do like Groundhog Day starring the Hulk, but like I wouldn't be able to pull that off,
Right.
And so you really kind of have to say, all right, like you start thinking about characters first, where you're saying, okay, somebody like Elektra, for example, we did that Elektra story in Black, White, and Blood, and I was kind of like, she's an assassin. Who's like, what if she was like on the same job as another assassin? Like, what happens? And so I said, like, what about Black Widow? I don't think we've ever seen those two interact, or if we have, it's been limited. They had actually fought in one comic prior to this. And so, I pitched to my editor, Devin Lewis. I was like, hey, what if we had Elektra breaking into the Red Room? And, back when Natasha was still there. And so they had to go head to head. It's sort of that, you kind of find like what's a concept that like generates a nice spark, and then you can kind of just start exploring it. The good thing about these comics is like, you don't have to ask yourself, well, are they going to die? They're probably not going to die. And so you have to figure out other ways to come up with stakes. You have to figure out other ways to kind of be responsible with the toys, to put them back. But at the same time, especially if you're doing like a series like Savage Avengers, for example, you can, I kind of love writing that book because it's my cast of misfit toys. Like nobody's really demanding, hey, we need Cloak and Dagger to be doing X, Y, Z. Nobody was demanding Cloak and Dagger. That's great. That means I can do all sorts of stuff with Cloak and Dagger, while they're in the confines of my book. So, first thing I said was, all right, you need Cloak and Dagger. When you think of them, you think of them as a couple. Their names are literally coupled together as superheroes. So, all right, throw them in a love triangle, see what happens. And so it's a lot of experimentation, and thankfully, my editors have been really cool about just kind of letting me try things. And it's just been a real pleasure, getting to write characters like the Savage Avengers, the main Avengers. I wrote them in Avengers Unlimited that came out over the summer. Moon Knight was a really fun one. I was just rereading that this week. Doing a short with him, with Mark and his alters. You just find things about the characters that you love, and then you kind of explore that. And I don't know. It really does feel like a dream gig, and it's sort of I always say, like, imitation is the sincerest form of flattery, but I think remixing is kind of the sincerest form of fandom to me. And that's something that I really try to approach in all my projects.
Right. Awesome. Well, and you have mentioned with working with Savage Avengers that you had a list of original ideas, and it sounds like the process is you ask Marvel and just ask if they're available. It doesn't sound like they really dictate who needs to be in it. I'm kind of curious. Yeah. Can you share like who was in your original list of like who you wanted to begin with?
Yeah, I mean, I got almost all the characters that I wanted. I mean, like I said, like I would always sort of have, I knew certain roles that needed to be filled on this particular team. And so I would pitch several characters for each role.
Gotcha.
And so for Savage Avengers, for example, they were very, when Tom approached me for that project, it was literally, hey, we're looking to relaunch this book. Do you have any ideas? And my first thought was, and actually, talking about projects that like, maybe aren't ready at that moment, I had come up with a concept a few years prior that was basically Conan versus the Terminator. And I wrote it thinking I'd pitch that to Dark Horse. And then as I finished that outline that week, Marvel announced that they had the rights to Conan. And so I was like, bummer. I guess I'm going to have to like file the serial numbers off and try to turn it into a creator owned or something. But I was working pretty hard on Grand Theft Astro and the OZ and Chapel. And so it just didn't wind up happening. And so when Marvel came to me and said, hey, what do you think about Savage Avengers? My very first thought was, wait, I can kind of strip this pitch. And so, I was like, what if we did Conan versus Deathlock? It's sort of like Conan versus the Terminator. We have them running around the Hyborian age, and we could throw in some superheroes that kind of get caught in the crossfire. And they went for that very quickly. It's at least the process that I've had at Marvel so far, and I'm really grateful for that, is that they seem to speak my language in terms of I'm like, hey, I kind of have this elevator pitch of an idea. What do you think? And so, for Avengers Unlimited, for example, I was like, what if we did, somebody found Nick Fury's files. Nick Fury had a bunch of files on the Avengers, and these are what they are. And then we can kind of figure out, like, actually, it wasn't Nick Fury. Like, Count Nefaria found them, and we find out later that was actually Nick Fury's kind of sting operation against Count Nefaria. And at the end, he says, if you think that was the real Black Ledger, you're wrong, because if Nefaria had my real plans, you wouldn't be walking out alive. But yeah, as far as like my original picks for Savage Avengers, I mean, most of the people that I pitched initially made the cut. I begged for Elektra as Daredevil. So I was very happy when they said that we could use her. But I begged for Cloak and Dagger. I was told that there had been no plans for Cloak and Dagger, so that was no problem. Black Knight, I kind of floated. This was right before the Eternals movie came out, so I thought maybe that would be like a good, this might be Dane's moment. And actually, for a character that I was least sure about, Dane winds up like he continuously kind of like creeps his way through the book, and like anytime I have a situation, a lot of times I'm like, well, that sounds like a Dane situation, and so he pops up a lot more than I ever expected. Like I had pitched Dakin. But like I said, he's busy over in Marauders, and we wound up finding like a really good angle on Weapon H.
Mm-hmm.
I pitched Carnage, but I'd also pitched Flash Thompson. I said if Carnage isn't available, Flash Thompson would be great. And I remember actually being told at the time that they were like, we don't think it'll be an issue for Dakin, but Flash might be a tough one. And then a week later, they were like, actually, we got that backwards. There were a few other characters that like didn't wind up making the final cut, just because like we already have a pretty crowded cast, and actually the cast is growing in our second arc a little bit. So, it's a lot to fit into 20 pages. But I remember I had on the list, I had Black Widow and White Widow. I had Rachel Cole Alvis as the Punisher. I knew that there was going to be a Punisher relaunch, so I knew Frank was off the table. Moon Knight almost made it, but there were lots of deep down, like there were a lot of backup options. Like at one point, there was Kane from Spider-Man as the Scarlet Spider. He was way down on the list. There was even a version of this where I had Azazel. If they wouldn't let me have Cloak and Dagger.
Yeah.
There was Faiza Hussein as Excalibur, I think her code name was. I didn't really know about Dane Whitman's daughter when I was pitching this. That was sort of coming up. That series I think was starting to come out when I pitched it. When I pitched Savage Avengers, so I wasn't privy to any of that behind the scenes stuff. I think those were kind of the names that I had originally thrown about. But I mean, I had talked with my editors. I was like, it depends on kind of what angle you're looking for. Like, I was like, you could do the Bendis version of New Avengers here and just do what Jerry Dugan did. Essentially, you have Logan, you have Venom, you have Ghost Rider, you have Punisher, you have Elektra, and maybe Black Widow. But I appreciate that my editors kind of picked up the vibe that I was going for, which was like, we could do that, but like Jerry Dugan already did that for the most part, and why try to kind of imperfectly replicate something that Jerry already did so well when we could, especially with these lesser known characters, we could find ways to honor what Jerry did, but take our own twist on it. And really kind of celebrate the weirder corners of the Marvel universe. And so it's been a dream book to write. It's been very fun. We're pretty far ahead as far as the storyline is concerned, and we have a lot of fun stuff coming that difficult. It's difficult to talk about because I'm several issues ahead, and Carlos is almost as far ahead. Carlos Magno, our artist on the book, and meanwhile, readers are still kind of digesting just the end of the first arc. It's a weird form of time travel in a way.
Yeah. Well, and I want to ask you this question before I move on to the other question, because you brought up about how bring in some of the characters and see if they're available and everything. And you mentioned Elektra as Daredevil.
Yeah.
And I'm actually reading the current run by Chip Zdarsky with Daredevil, and Elektra's in it. And so I'm kind of curious, how does he kind of fit in both of these stories? I don't know if these are like two different universes or what, but I know she's in the Daredevil run right now. So how would you explain how she's in both of these stories right now, given what happens with Savage Avengers? Okay.
Time travel.
That's what I was thinking.
That's one of the great parts about this storyline is that, like, we can drop them back off and they've been gone, like,
right where they got picked up, right?
Yeah, right where they picked up, or she lost a week, it's so that's nice. It kind of lets us kind of dance between the continuity raindrops a little bit, and the stories are still canon, they still exist, but yeah, it still is in a way that hopefully doesn't impact what Chip is doing in any way. But that that's the great thing is, like, we discuss a lot of things with the different editors. My editorial team often interfaces with, like, I think it's Devin Lewis's office, I think, coordinates both Venom and Daredevil. So
Gotcha.
it's kind of nice because that's really the only office right now with any of the characters elsewhere.
Mhm.
Cloak and Dagger and Weapon H, nobody was really using, and I don't know what the plans are in the future with Black Knight. I'm not privy to any of that, but
Right.
as Dane doesn't have a book on his own right now, I
Right.
get a little bit more free reign. So yeah, it's really Elektra that we want to keep an eye out on, and
Mhm.
Flash to like a lesser extent, just making sure that we don't like mess up anything continuity wise with the symbiotes. But
Right.
you know, that's the great thing about my cast of Misfit toys is that we do get a decent amount of free reign.
Yeah. Well, and what I love with this run of Savage Avengers is just as you mentioned, you're bringing in some of the lesser known characters like Weapon H. I've never heard of until I started reading Savage Avengers. I've always heard about Anti Venom, but I never read any stories that he was in it, and I didn't realize it was Flash Thompson that was Anti Venom as well too.
Yeah,
So I think that it must have been a lot of fun. It sounds like it was for you to be able to bring these characters and just like you said, play around with
yeah,
having the stories and kind of incorporate them, and it must have been a lot of fun to do that. So
yeah, and every character I think is a little bit of a litmus test.
mhm.
I mean, Flash Thompson's a great example. I mean, there are some people who might focus on his military background.
Right.
That's perfectly valid. There's some people who might focus extra hard on like, you know, he's somebody who his whole hero's journey was he was Peter Parker's Spider-Man's ultimate fanboy while he was Peter Parker's ultimate bully. And
Hmm.
somebody could easily have sort of adopted the approach of like he wanted to be a superhero and now like he died and came back and maybe he's kind of thinking like, oh, that was a huge mistake. Like,
Right.
how do I live like I can't live a normal life like this? That sort of the hero worship shine it might have faded.
Hmm.
Um, for me, I really just you know Flash Thompson from his very first appearance is a douchebag. He's just he's the jock. He's the ladies' man. He's extremely full of himself, extremely cocky. And I was like, yeah, that's Flash for me.
Right.
And so kind of writing him where everybody's like, where's Conan? The occult is about to unleash a snake god and destroy the planet 10,000 years out of schedule. And Flash is meanwhile turned into Dagger, and he's like, "Hey, you're with an Avenger now. If you want, I'll introduce you to Captain America when we get home." Um,
Which was a
like
great panel, by the way. I think it was a Cloak that was just like, really, you're doing this right now?
yeah, it's those kind of moments that like
Hmm.
it's he's sort of like the old school Hawkeye or the old school Wolverine of the
Yeah.
team. The team irritant is what a lot of people would call that kind of character.
Hmm.
And that's the cool thing about like especially writing an ensemble book. And I feel like so often I tend to gravitate towards that, like just like they say, like evolution, everything tends to evolve towards the form of a crab.
Hmm.
I tend to always evolve towards the form of an ensemble book.
Hmm.
That just, it's anytime I can turn a book into an ensemble book, I almost always go for that. Just because like you have so many different perspectives and so many different voices, and the more characters, I think the more potential to do stuff.
Hmm.
So yeah, I know there was an actual question in there, and but yeah, I think getting a book like this, you really get a lot of free reign, and it's just a matter of kind of finding an angle, finding a perspective on each of these characters, and then committing
Hmm.
to it.
Yeah. Well, and one of the exciting things I think for Savage Avengers in terms of timing and everything, and you had mentioned this earlier with Marvel's license with Conan, is that
Yeah,
you got to do something that it seems like not a lot of creators get to do, which was retire a character and kind of give it an interesting ending with this run. And this is a spoiler alert for anyone who hasn't read the issue 5 of Savage Avengers yet, but you got to retire Conan as somebody who is, kind of took what his experience was as Avengers and made his own team back in his homeland. And I thought that was a really fitting and a really cool way to kind of wrap up that story of Conan and be able to send him off to his next adventure that way.
Yeah, that was a really interesting experience. It's when I was first approached to write Savage Avengers, I was told like, hey, it's up to you if you want to use Conan. Jerry Dugan Jerry Dugan hadn't finished writing his run yet when they approached me. So it was very much one of those like we could send him home, we could not. And my thinking was, well, how often am I going to get an opportunity to write Conan the Barbarian? It could kind of be dealer's choice where we go from here. This could be our way of sending Conan home. Or we can bring him into a future arc. And at the time we hadn't locked in 2099 yet as our second arc, but we knew we wanted to do like a far future second arc. So I was like, Conan, it'd be cool to have him in the far future, but it's really kind of up to you guys, like, or we can kind of play it by ear and just see kind of how everything goes. By the time we hit the end of the first arc, we can make a decision there. And I had just finished writing our second issue when the decision was actually made for me. We found out about that Conan's rights were not going to be extended past 2022. And so really, there wasn't a ton of shifting beyond that. I mean, it was just kind of like, okay, like this idea that, all right, issue 5 will be Conan's last issue. We probably could have kept him a tiny bit longer, but just, based on the way that the deal was going to be arranged, I didn't feel right trying to take him out like mid arc, like Conan leaving is an event. And so really the only shifting that kind of came out of that was, I talked to my editors and I was just like, well, I'd love to have like kind of a new central figure for the second arc. And what if we did Punisher 2099? If Frank Castle is busy in his own series with Jason Aaron, we could kind of do this in a way that honors Jerry Dugan's original lineup. We didn't have a Punisher. But in a way that's very different and still speaks to that far future.
Right.
So if there were any changes really to anything, some minor cosmetic changes to the second arc. We tweaked the villain a little bit just to make sure we weren't doing anything that was like even tangentially related to Conan, which was fine. Honestly, I think now having written most of that arc, I feel very happy with how it turned out. So it was one of those things. I sweated that 5th issue a little bit. It went through several iterations. That was where my newspaper training came in real handy because I had to kind of cut to the bone to make sure that we were able to fit a big moment for every character and in ways that would kind of fuel the soap opera for the next storyline, while still giving Conan enough real estate to give him like a solid goodbye. And people seem to really respond to that. I know, I think a lot of people, especially when you get into this stage of, when you're writing for the big two, I think there are a lot of people who sometimes kind of want you to fail, because it's not really you who's failing, it's Marvel or it's DC.
Right.
It's sort of the worst of like the sports team mentality.
Right.
And so I think the fact that like people seem to nobody really found a lot of ways to complain about how we sent off Conan. And that's good. I feel like that means I did my job. And it was a huge honor. I think being able to write what I believe is the final Marvel comic with Conan in it, it's a huge honor. It's a huge responsibility, and it was one that I took really seriously. I'm really kind of grateful that I got to be in that position. And it was challenging, but I'm very happy with how it turned out. And a lot of that I owe to Carlos Magno, who just, I was kind of new to Conan when I started writing it. I didn't know Conan backwards and forwards the way that I knew the Marvel universe, but Carlos, on the other hand, is like a diehard Conan fan. I remember in issue 4 we had a bit where Conan is kind of strapped to some ceremonial altar, and I remember writing in the script. I said at the time, I said, do we want his hands nailed in, or is that kind of too gory for the for the tone that Marvel wants? And Carlos was the one who was like, well, actually, Conan got his hands nailed in this story, and it took him months to heal. So maybe we just do it like, we just have him cuffed instead. And I was like, great, like fantastic. Carlos really, I mean, he's such a pro, and he's so gracious, just an amazing partner to work with, and he's inhumanly fast, like too fast, if anything. I was killing myself over an issue of Savage Avengers a week and a half ago, because I was desperate that I was like, I have to be an issue ahead of Carlos at any particular time. And so I get to go back on that hamster wheel in like a week and a half, because Carlos has already turned in pencils for a whole other issue.
Right.
And he'll be done with inks. He'll be done with inks by this time next week, if not sooner.
Gotcha.
He's just he's so talented. And yeah, I just it's the end of an era, and I'm grateful to Marvel for letting me for trusting me in that moment, and for Conan Properties for letting us tell that moment. And I think there's lots of cool stuff ahead for Conan. I think he's in good hands with Jim Zub over at Titan, and so I'm excited to read his next adventures as a fan.
Yeah, that's fantastic, and it's really great kind of hearing the experience you've had with being able to write that story and the fans' reaction to it. Because I gotta say, I absolutely love that panel of how you all ended that story, and just the fact that it seems like he has his own Avengers team with his current, time and era and things like that. So I think that was such a great way to end that. So before I let you go,
sure,
and you'll be the first person I'm doing this with, but I'm going to see if this is something that guests likes to do and how it goes and everything like that. But you are also writing a couple issues of Fantastic Four in addition to Savage Avengers. So I want to ask you, and I don't know if writers like this or not. So tell me now before I get, too crazy with this, but in a fight between Weapon H and the Thing, right? I knew I'd get that kind of reaction.
It depends on whose book it is.
Exactly.
If I was writing this, if I was writing it in Savage Avengers, I would say Ben would certainly have his work cut out for him. But if I was writing if I was writing this match in Savage Avengers, something would have to happen to Clay that like he'd have to have some sort of serious handicap, like either his gamma core isn't starting, or or it's fluctuating, so you can't really like control like what powers he's doing at any particular moment. Or like Ben would have to have some sort of like major power up. I think it'd be easier if it was in Fantastic Four, because then you could just say, somebody's mind controlling Weapon H, and suddenly you got to deal with a Hulk and a Wolverine, both of whom have given Ben some very grievous injuries in the past, and then you kind of have Ben, But I at the same time, I feel like Dan Slott really told like the best version of that story. It was the issue of Ben and his honeymoon, fighting the Hulk. That was probably the best version of that story. Although he managed to have his cake and eat it too, because he managed to do it in Empire. I'm pretty sure that was Dan, fighting against a possessed She-Hulk, and Ben saying like, all right, I'm not going down, so I guess I'm the immortal Thing. Like there's really, I don't know how you top that. But Ben is a great character. I mean, he's kind of one of the all-time great Marvel characters. It's like it's a coin toss between him and Peter Parker, you know.
Yeah.
And I think we have a really cool Ben moment in our next issue of Fantastic Four. Just because, like, as much as this is a Sue story, I felt like I couldn't resist like getting a good beat with Ben. Yeah, I mean, I guess if you're saying who wins in a fight between Thing and Weapon H, chances are it's the Thing as the underdog.
Nice. Yeah.
You know, I think having him as an underdog story, but really the answer is whoever's the underdog and whoever's book this is.
Right.
That's the answer. It's funny.
And I have to say, I picked up your Fantastic Four issue, and I have not read it yet.
Oh, geez.
And I have to say and share again, spoiler alert for anyone who hasn't read it yet, but I did see on Twitter about how you wrote in a homage to a very popular movie. And it got me excited to read that. It's one of my next issues I'm going to read just because I love that movie. And I think that's so great to pull that in. So, yeah.
Yeah. You'll have to let me know what you think. Yeah, you know, it was a fun process. You know, my Savage Avengers editors are also the editors in Fantastic Four.
Oh,
and so,
great.
You know, when they sort of found out, like, okay, Dan's run is going to wrap up, and you know, and they knew that I assume they knew that Ryan North was going to be taking over. I assume that was decided before they had tapped me. But you know, they were like, okay, you know, Judgment Day is coming out. We've got some room for 2 issues. Would you be interested? And you know, Fantastic Four, that's history. You know, that is the book that built Marvel.
Right.
And so I couldn't say no to that. And the fact that Tom was like, you know, I'd really love to do like a Sue Storm focused thing. And I was like, that actually works out perfectly. You know, I think there's so much. Sue is an overlooked character in many ways. And I think there's so many cool stuff that can be told, especially, you know, through the lens of Judgment Day. You know, that's a story that is ultimately a superhero story that sort of focuses on fire and brimstone and religion and judgment, and but also faith. And what is faith if something that you cannot see but you irresistibly feel? And that's something that is both the Invisible Woman's powers, but also kind of her cosmic love story with Reed Richards, which is really the emotional through line of the story. So I'm really proud of that book. I'm really proud of the work that Juan Cabal, the artist in the book, did. He is just a real talent and a real storyteller. He added so many great flourishes to that 2-parter that really elevated the story, I think, in some really important ways. And so, yeah, I'm really, it's a little intimidating sort of being in the middle of the narrative sandwich that is Dan Slott and Ryan North. You know, it is intimidating to follow Dan, especially as somebody who I've known for almost 15 years now. But I like to think we hold our own.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, I'm excited to read it. So, David, thank you very much for coming on the show and sharing with us your comics journey. Before I let you go, can you let everybody know where they can find you online?
Yeah, you can follow me on Twitter and Instagram at PeposD or David Pepose Comics on Facebook. You can also follow my newsletter, Pep Talks, at bit.ly/pepnews, or visit my website at davidpepose.com.
And that wraps up another episode of The Caption Life. Don't forget to hit the subscribe button. You can follow us on social media at Caption Life. For more information about us and all of our previous episodes, visit thecaptionlife.com.